On Being a Pagan. Alain de Benoist. Translated by John Graham, edited by Greg Johnson. 2004. Originally published in French under the title Comment peut-on, étre, paien? Under the pen name Albin Michel, 1981. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 17, Tolerance and Intolerance. I believe, declares Gilbert Durand, that the human world is polytheist when it tolerates the other, when it does not fall back onto a single book. If this is forgotten, knowledge is blocked. Polytheism always leads to the creation of a comparative literature. It is generally acknowledged that paganism contains a constituent principle of tolerance. A system that accepts a limitless number of gods not only accepts the plurality of the forms of worship that address them, but also, and especially, the plurality of mores, social and political systems, conceptions of the world for which these gods are so many sublimated expressions. We know that the ancients believed that the best proof that all the gods did or could exist was that the people worshipping them also existed. In Athens there was even an altar to the unknown god. This freedom of thought resulting from the absence of all religious dogma was quite naturally transposed onto the political plane. For centuries the Roman Empire respected the customs and institutions of all the peoples it conquered. It multiplied the number of provincial cities and organized their freedoms. It knew how to federate people without subjugating them. Pagan tolerance, which subsequently played into the hands of Christian propaganda in some instances, is expressed in these words of Symmachus: to each his customs, to each his rights. The divine spirit has given certain guardians to the cities. Just as each mortal receives a soul at birth, each people receives its guardian spirits. Paganism is tolerant by nature, not only because it is, potentially, polytheist, and polytheism is already a sublimated form of pluralism, but also because it is not dualistic, because it opposes to the fundamental discontinuity of God and the world, the dialectical continuity of everything, men, gods, nature, that forms and embodies the single being that is the world, and because it postulates that a God who is not of this world is precisely incapable of being a God. Because it is either one or the other, either God is unique and distinct from the world or the world is unique and contains both men and gods. To the assertion of the preeminent non-God, my kingdom is not of this world, John 18:36, is opposed the preeminent divine affirmation, the abode of men is the abode of the gods. Likewise, from the standpoint of on-dualistic monotheism, the affirmation of God's uniqueness is not opposed to that of the world's uniqueness, it makes it sacred. This kind of God also remains tolerant, because he is made from all the diverse elements of the world. It could be said that he even represents the unique diversity of a being who has not excluded any otherness, any difference, because he exalts and reconciles all differences. J.B.S. Haldane lists fanaticism and totalitarian intolerance among the inventions made between 3000 and 1400 BC and attributes their paternity to Judeo-Christian monotheism. The characteristic intolerance and fanaticism of the prophets and missionaries of the three monotheist religions, writes Mircea Eliade, have their model and justification in the example set by Yahweh. These opinions should not be cause for surprise. The unique God of the Bible is the sole possessor, the sole author of an equally unique truth. He represents absolute good. How could he not oppose evil? If there is a unique, universal truth, if truth is entirely independent of the events and configurations that take place in the world, if evil is no longer id quod malus est, what people say is evil merely arises from the misuse of freedom by created beings, then one cannot be doth right and wrong, and one certainly cannot act beyond good and evil. With the idea of a unique truth comes the principle of an absolute identity and its corollary, the excluded middle. Henceforth, one lives in error or truth, in evil or good. There can neither be relative verities nor several conflicting truths. It will be or else, or else. The struggle against error then becomes not only a right but a duty as well, whether this duty is exercised effectively or not. That absolutism, more than relativism and pluralism, leads to intolerance, that it brings about, more than paganism, the disappearance of sapra sun, would seem to be self-evident. What characterizes the law in the Bible, Jacques Goldstein emphasizes, is its savage theocentrism and absolute totalitarianism with respect to what concerns reference to God. But absolutism is not the only thing implicated. What intrinsically connects Judeo-Christian monotheism to intolerance, as we have just seen, is not only the fact that this unique God is conceived as radically distinct from the world in his nature. Fundamentally, the gods of paganism are non-others. The God of Judeo-Christian monotheism is the preeminent example of otherness. He is the completely other. Now the very fact of setting up a completely other necessarily tends to promote the lesser significance of the other. This biblical rupture in some way eradicates the other to the benefit of the completely other. By devaluing the very concept of alterity, the Bible forbids the same from linking with the other. Whereas paganism preserves all freedoms, tolerates all acknowledgments, legitimizes all interpretations, to the very degree that the gods do not represent the negation or suffocation of some gods by others. Judeo-Christian monotheism, in its smothering, imprisoning aspect, can only reject everything that it is not. In his capacity as not only the solitary, but the incomparable one, Yahweh can only assert the falsity of what others venerate and thereby assert the falsity of the lifestyles and world conceptions this veneration expresses. From Yahweh's viewpoint, the differences between men and between peoples are transitory, secondary, and in a word, superficial. All the nations of the world are as nothing before Yahweh, he holds them as nothingness and emptiness. Isaiah 40:17. Yahweh is the God who refuses the other, the God who started by setting himself up as superior to the other gods, then later declared that he regarded them as non-existent. For the other God does not exist. He is depicted as only an idol, an appearance of God, at God lacking the value of a God. Transposed onto the secular plane, this reasoning would appear to legitimize all forms of fear of otherness, all forms of racism, all exclusions. From the notion of the God without the value of a God we move on to that of the man without the value of a man, of life without the value of life. Man acts toward his fellows the way Yahweh acts toward other gods. In biblical monotheism, hell is other people, in the true sense of the term. It can be seen from this that a favorable, in short, logical relationship exists between totalitarian intolerance, the refusal of the other, the assertion of a unique God and a unique truth, and the anthropology of the same induced by Judeo-Christian monotheism. And the process mins in both directions. Just as the refusal of the other logically leads to envisioning its suppression, this refusal also chips away at the identity of the one expressing it. We can in fact only become fully aware of our own identity through confrontation with a general variance. One only posits oneself by being opposed to another, we also have need of the other to understand how we differ from it. The rejection or the devaluation of the other is therefore at the same time the rejection of the dialectical movement that allows self-construction and self-transformation through positive confrontation with the other. Based on a sufficient degree of ignorance about others, notes Jules Montereau, my God is certainly the only God. This is perhaps why all forms of universalism, religious and profane, while they bring about the negation of others' identities, also require the abnormally enlarged ignorance or unawareness of their own identity by those who lay claim to or proclaim them. Where self-awareness is immediately transparent to itself, the other is first perceived as an object that is interpreted, or more exactly instrumentalized by consciousness based on the consistently subjective data it receives. The temptation is therefore quite great in such a system to interpret the other in this world as a simple projection of the self, which can then lead to the desire to eliminate everything in it that is different and does not conform to this projection. This is precisely the case with racist xenophobia, which carries with it an interpretation of a reductive, monotheist nature, and consists of instituting, whether explicitly or not, a unitarian, one-dimensional hierarchy connected to allegedly objective criteria, which are in fact purely projections of individual values. But this is also the case, and perhaps even more so, for the racism of identity denial or racism of assimilation, as opposed to racism of exclusion, that consists of reducing the other to the same and proclaiming that there are only men and peoples who are all like the others. Subsequently, this implicitly legitimizes the destruction of the unique way of life of a populace, the disintegration and absorption of its institutions, beliefs, its characteristic moral, social, and cultural values, and the loss of its personality, its destiny, and its soul. By asserting the primacy of the completely other, biblical monotheism creates the secular conditions for the devaluation of the other. But with the same stroke they also dialectically create the conditions for a denial of the relative same. In fact, if the other is devalued, the others tend to amount to the same. Humanity is no longer composed of relative others and relative sames, but of the appearance of others, almost sames, others with the vocation of the sames, facing the sole absolute of the completely other. This is why the biblical resistance to the domination by the other can also caricature itself in resistance to domination by the same, whose counterpart is acceptance of domination by the completely other. Undoubtedly Nietzsche is among those who have perceived this division best. Evoking paganism, he writes in an aphorism from the Gay Science entitled, The Greatest Advantage of Polytheism. There was only one norm, man, and every people thought that it possessed this one ultimate norm. But above and outside, in some distant overworld, one was permitted to behold a plurality of norms. One God was not considered a denial of another God nor blasphemy against him. It was here that the luxury of individuals was first permitted. It was here that one first honored the rights of individuals. The invention of gods, heroes, and superhumans of all kinds, as well as near humans and subhumans, dwarfs, fairies, centaurs, satyrs, demons, and devils was the inestimable preliminary exercise for the justification of the egoism and sovereignty of the individual, the freedom that one conceded to a god in his relation to other gods, one eventually also granted to oneself in relation to laws, customs, and neighbors. Monotheism, on the other hand, this rigid consequence of the doctrine of one human type, the faith in one normal God beside whom there are only pseudo-gods, was perhaps the greatest danger that has yet confronted humanity. Yahweh is not only a jealous God. He also feels hatred. I loved Jacob, but I hated Esau, Malachi 1:3. He recommends this hate to those who invoke him. Do not I hate them, O Yahweh, who hate thee, and am I not grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred, I count them as my enemies. Psalms 139:21-22. In your bounty, O Lord, destroy the impious. Psalms 139:19. Jeremiah cries out, render them their just recompense, O Yahweh, exterminate all of them from beneath your heavens. Lamentations 3:64-66. The book of Jeremiah is itself only a long series of curses and anathemas against peoples and nations, in which the enumeration of future punishments fills the narrator with a dark joy. May they know terror and I be not terrified. Bring down on their heads the day of misfortune, break them twice. 17:18. Abandon thus their sons to famine, deliver them to the mercy of the sword. May their wives become sterile and widowed. May their husbands die of plague. 18-21, and on it goes. We have seen that the fight against idolatry is a legitimate one because idolatry is incorporated into evil. You will banish the evil from your midst, Deuteronomy 17:7. Yahweh therefore promises the Hebrews his support in any wars they undertake. When your God Yahweh shall have cut off the nations from before thee so thou may invade and dispossess them, you shall succeed them and dwell in their lands. Deuteronomy 12:29. As for the cities of those people which Yahweh has given as your inheritance, you shall leave none that breathe alive. Deuteronomy 20:16. Yahweh himself provided a fine example of genocide by unleashing the deluge against a humanity that had displeased him. During the time he resided with the Philistine king Achish, David also practiced genocide. 1 Samuel 27:9. Moses organized the extermination of the Midianite people. Numbers 31:7. Joshua massacred the inhabitants of Hazor and the Anakim. Hazor was once the capital of all this kingdom. Everyone that lived there was put to the sword because of the anathema. Not a single soul was left alive. Joshua 11:10-11. See also 11:20-21. The Messianic king extolled by Solomon was also to unleash a similar reign of terror. May he purify Jerusalem of all the Gentiles who trample upon it miserably. May he exterminate with his wisdom and justice the sinners of this land. May he destroy the impious nations with the words of his mouth. Hatred against the pagans also explodes out of the books of Esther and Judith, and so on. Not one ancient religion, except that of the Hebrew people, displayed this degree of intolerance, notes Emile Gilabert. This was something Renan also asserted earlier. The intolerance of the Semitic people is an inevitable consequence of their monotheism. The Indo-European peoples, before their conversion to Semitic ideas, never regarded their religion as an absolute truth. Rather they viewed it as a kind of family or caste heritage, and for this reason intolerance and proselytizing remained foreign to them. This is why we find among these peoples a freedom of thought, a spirit of critical inquiry, and individual research. There is certainly no question of looking at this in such stark terms or of contrasting one unsound truth with another. There have been massacres and exterminations everywhere at all times. But one will seek in vain in the sacred or profane texts of paganism for an equivalent of what can be found repeatedly throughout the Bible. The idea that such massacres can be morally justified, the idea that they can be expressly authorized and desired by a God, because of the anathema, as commanded by Moses, servant of Yahweh, Joshua 11:12, so that among these authors good conscience continues to reign, not in spite of these massacres, but purely and simply because of them. Starting in the time that directly followed the life of Christ, Christianity essentially took over this tradition of intolerance with renewed energy. The message of Jesus recorded by Luke, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and his children, his brothers and sisters, yes even his own life, he cannot be my disciple," 14:26, has caused a lot of ink to be spilled. Some perceive this word hate as a Hebrew idiom and claim that it should simply be taken to mean that Jesus wished to be preferred absolutely over all other beings. Others see a trace of Gnostic contamination in this phrase, connected to renunciation, the voluntary despoliation of worldly goods, and the refusal to procreate. In this context, this obligation to hate one's parents would be a corollary of not wanting children. Obviously, these interpretations remain purely speculative. What we do know for certain is that Christian intolerance made its appearance very early. Over the centuries it was employed against infidels as well as against pagans, Jews, and heretics. It began with the extermination of ancient culture, the murders of Julian and of Hypatia, the ban on pagan cults, the destruction of temples and statues, the suppression of the Olympic Games, the arson of the Serapeum in Alexandria instigated by that city's bishop, Theophilus, in 389, which brought about the pillaging of the immense library of 700,000 volumes collected by the Ptolemies. This was followed by forced conversion, compel and tear, the extinction of positive science, persecution, and burnings. Ammianus Marcellinus had said earlier, "The wild beasts are no greater enemies of men than the Christians chatter in their midst." And Sulpicius Severus, "Now, everything is troubled by the discord of the bishops. Everywhere hate and favor, fear, envy, ambition, debauchery, avarice, arrogance, laziness, it is a general state of corruption." Theocracy, in the proper sense of the word, is born in tandem with the reduction of the human political order to the moral prescriptions that govern the city of God. It, too, is a return to the unique. Renan noted earlier that in the monotheism of the Bible, the government of the universe became an absolute monarchy. Georges Natoff defined the theocratic ideal with this formulation: anarchy plus God. This ideal, based on the illusion of a natural order, resumes and considerably transforms the opposition between an immutable law, Torah, and the laws men give themselves, lex/nomos. One could pose as a hypothesis, writes Jean-Louis Tristany, that the Torah/nomos couple provides the opposition that allows, in an initial stage, for the organization of different cultures on an axis that goes from servitude to liberty. Mosaic law would constitute in some way the 0 point of freedom, whereas the Greek nomos causes the conditions for the formation of such a system to emerge. All forms of exclusion will henceforth bear the mark of the odium theologicum. The pagan could err but not be obstinate. Perseverare diabolicum, seeking to persevere in the way he lives would thus become diabolic. Fidelity, to the ancestral faith, will be condemned, whereas its denial, called conversion, will serve as exemplary. This conversion, when not the result of conviction or self-interest, can be forced, as the Saxons, the Stadinger, and the Cathars knew quite well. By legitimizing the massacre ad majorem Dei gloriam, Christianity continues to support the phenomenon of a good conscience among the perpetrators. Over the course of the centuries, the will to suppress the other would ceaselessly be reborn, in wider and wider circles, from the revelation contrary to the revelation, of the existence of another, confident in his own completeness. For this reason, there was during the early days of colonization, notes Jean Baudrillard, a moment of disbelief and stupefaction before this very possibility of escaping from the universal law of the gospel. This created a dilemma: either one accepted that this law was not universal, or one exterminated the Indians to erase the proofs. Generally, converting them was enough, or simply even discovering them, which was enough to ensure their slow extermination. The Jews were the first to suffer from the monotheism of others. Christian antisemitism, which finds its earliest justification in the fourth gospel, perhaps under the influence of Gnosticism, and to which numerous studies have been devoted, has never stopped developing across the ages. It is clear that the current tendency of Christian churches to reintegrate their origins and reappropriate the Hebrew roots that support them, a tendency that only proves one thing: the conversion has instead worked in the opposite direction than planned, alters nothing of a past that has represented itself for so long. What appears to me as the best explanation for the cause of Christian antisemitism is the very closeness of the Jewish faith to the Christian. As Jacques Solé wrote, one always persecutes one's neighbors. Only a small ditch separates Christians and Jews, but for this reason, as Nietzsche pointed out, the smallest ditch is, also, the most impossible to bridge. More precisely, during the first centuries of the Christian era, antisemitism was born from the Christian claim to have supplanted Judaism, to have fulfilled it and given it its true meaning. For the Christians, salvation comes from the Jews, John 4:22, but it is Christianity that is the veris Israel. Hence the expression perfidi, used until recently by the Church in Good Friday services in reference to the Jews, an expression that does not have the modern meaning of perfidious, but the original meaning of faithless. It was St. Paul who first expressed this claim more forcefully. At the same time he substituted grace for law. Paul distinguished the Israel of God from the Israel of the flesh, 1 Corinthians 10:18, which led him to oppose the circumcision of the Spirit to just plain circumcision. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inside, and circumcision is that of the heart, by the Spirit and not by the letter. Such a man's praise comes not from men but from God, Romans 2:28-29. Conclusion: it is we who are the circumcised, Philippians 3:3. From the Christian viewpoint, this reasoning has a certain coherence. As Claude Tresmonton said, if the last of the Nabi of Israel, the Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth, meaning Jesus, is truly the Messiah, then Israel's vocation to become the light of nations must be fully achieved, and the universalism implied by this vocation must be put completely into operation. Just as the law, having reached its end, in both sense of the word, with the Christ, has become useless, the distinction between Israel and the other nations has become moot. There is no longer either Jew or Greek, Galatians 3:28. And it is clearly universal Christianity that is the veris Israel. This process, triggered by Pauline reform, has had a double consequence. On the one hand, it led to the persecution of the Jews, depicted as the worst enemies of Christianity by very reason of their genealogical proximity and their refusal to convert, that is to say, to recognize Christianity as the true Israel. On the other hand, as noted by Shemuel Trigano, by setting itself up as the new Israel, the West has recognized a factual if not legal jurisdiction over itself by Judaism. This amounts to saying that the West has become Israelite to the very degree that it has forbidden Jews from asserting their true identity. The result is that the very notion of Judeo-Christianity is a double incarceration, imprisoning both the Christian West, which by its own doing is subject to a jurisdiction that is not its own, and puts it in the position, in order to assume it, of denying this jurisdiction to its legitimate keepers, and the Jews themselves, who find themselves unduly nailed to the alleged site of their fulfillment by another religion than their own. In fact, Trigano goes on to write, if Judeo-Christianity founded the West, then the very place of Israel is also the West. Subsequently, the requirement of Westernization becomes a requirement for assimilation and normalization and the denial of identity. The crisis of Jewish normality is the crisis of the Westernization of Judaism, therefore leaving the West means for the Jews to turn their backs on their normality and open themselves to their otherness. In the final analysis, this may be why Jewish communities today can no longer criticize the Western model unless they adopt a semi-amnesiac and semi-critical attitude toward their own specific history. Christian anti-Semitism can therefore be correctly described as a neurosis. For this reason, writes Jean Blot, it is because of a constituent alienation that the West should never attain itself, never find itself? And that the anti-Semitic neurosis stems from this. And Semitism permits the ant-Semite to project his neurosis onto the Jew. He will call him foreign, because that is how he feels, a thief, powerful, an upstart, because that is what he is. In a word, he calls him a Jew because he is this Jew, in the very depths of his soul, definitively devious, constituently alienated, foreign to his own religion, to his God, who embodies him. By exchanging its foundational myth for that of biblical monotheism, the West has transformed Hebrewness into its superego. From that point it can only turn against the Jews, whom it accuses not only of having failed to follow, by their conversion, the logical evolution leading from Mount Sinai to Christianity, but even attempting, through an alleged deicide, of preventing this evolution. The conversion of the West goes hand in hand with the accusations of non-conversion made against the Jews. Returning to a proposition I put forth earlier, it could be said that West became anti-Semitic to the very degree it attempted to become Israelite. It will stop being anti-Semitic by leaving this neurosis, by returning to its foundational myth, ceasing to wish to be something it is not in a way that allows the other to continue to be what it is. Many, even today, believe that if Jews were to renounce their distinct identity, the Jewish problem would vanish. A naive proposition at best, in the worst case it often conceals a conscious or unconscious form of anti-Semitism. This proposal, which evolves directly out of the racism of assimilation and identity denial I mentioned earlier, is only the reverse side of the racism of persecution and exclusion. In the West, Trigano reminds us, Jews, when they were not being persecuted, were only recognized as Jews on condition they were no longer Jews. In other words, to be accepted, they had to first reject themselves, they had to renounce being others in a way that allowed them to be reduced to the same. In the second form of racism, Jews are recognized but denied. In the first they are accepted but not recognized. The Church has served the Jews notice that they must choose between exclusion, or physical death, and renunciation, historical and spiritual death. By converting they became Christians like everybody else. The French Revolution freed the Jews individually but condemned them to disappear as a nation. Here again they were compelled to become citizens like everybody else. Marxism, too, claimed to ensure the liberation of the Jews by imposing a class-based division from which their destruction as a people would necessarily result. Just as the end of anti-Semitism will occur through the renunciation by the West of its claim to be the veris Israel, the positive end of the Jewish question will take place through the recognition of the Jewish people's identity and its right to live out its difference without allowing itself to be either reduced to a radical state of otherness or to the same. When one examines the great modern totalitarian systems, it is not hard to find there, in secular form, the same radical causes of intolerance whose religious roots we have just examined. This is mainly the structure of reduction of all diversity, of every relative other, to a unique absolute, sometimes identified with class, race, the state, a leader, or a party, and so on. Modern forms of totalitarianism have only secularized and transformed into a profane theodicy the system of the unique truth and one model to which all diversity must be boiled down. Simultaneously, the organization of these totalitarian systems is modeled on that of the Church and similarly exploits the themes of the masses, themes that are distinctive features of contemporary democracy. This secularization of the system has made totalitarianism all the more formidable, independent of the fact that religious intolerance has often provoked an equally destructive revolutionary intolerance in return, an ananiadromia, to borrow the term employed by Jung. Totalitarianism, writes Gilbert Durand, is further strengthened when the powers of monotheistic theology, which left the game of transcendence intact, have been transferred to a human institution, to a grand inquisitor. The same holds true for the many versions of utopian thought that also led to the creation of totalitarian systems. Leszek Kolakowski has shown that utopian thought includes three fundamental features: the belief that the future, in some mysterious way, is already upon us and we are in the process of seizing it, and not only vaguely foreseeing it. Next is the idea that we have at our disposal a sure method of thinking and acting capable of leading us to a society free of flaws, conflicts, and dissatisfaction. Finally, the belief that we know what man truly and really is, as opposed to what he is empirically and believes himself to be. It is not hard to find in these three components of utopia simple transpositions of the concept of monolinear and irreversible time, the explicatory reductivism specific to the theory of the unique, and the categorical anthropology, based on an abstract universal. To think that the true nature of totalitarianism is based on its use of particularly crushing means of coercion as its method of choice seems to me, consequently, to be a grave error. Historical experience has shown, and continues to show, that there can be a clean totalitarianism that through tenderness yields the same results as classic forms of totalitarianism. The happy robots of Brave New World do not enjoy a condition preferable to that of the slaves and prisoners of the concentration camps. Nor does totalitarianism essentially arise from Sanju, Stalin, Hegel, or Fichte. Totalitarianism appears when a flexible form of plural, polytheistic, and naturally contradictory totality that is inherent in organic interdependency is replaced by a rigid, monotheistic system that is based on an explicative uniqueness and a fatally reductive unilateralism. Totalitarianism is born from a desire to achieve social or human unity by reducing individual and popular diversity to a single model. It is in this sense that it is legitimate to oppose with Michel Maufessely, but also with Gilbert Durand, Max Weber, James Hillman, David Miller, and others, a polytheistic social system that refers to multiple and complementary gods to a monotheistic politics founded on the illusion of unity. Once the polytheism of values can no longer function, we are facing totalitarianism.